Hello, in this week's pre-record for People and the Natural Environment, I'm going to be talking about developing sustainable practices. This follows on from the discussions we've been having over recent weeks about the ways in which environmental worldviews tend to be shifting in quite a good direction, moving away from more dominant anthropocentric views about human beings being dominant over nature and nature being a resource for humans to consume, and moving towards more ecocentric and biocentric worldviews, which see human beings as part of a complex ecosystem that includes the natural environment as well as human created settlements. But what's interesting is that whilst we're seeing a change in worldviews and attitudes towards the environment, we are not yet seeing a reduction in the impact upon the natural environment that is caused by human behaviours and practices, particularly around consumption. So, if we think about consumption broadly, including things like travel, as well as products that we consume, and things like resources, energy, in the home, things like water and electricity and gas, then our consumption is actually becoming more damaging to the natural environment, even as our attitudes towards it are improving. One of the things that we looked at in previous weeks really was the difference between behaviours and practices, and how when we focus upon individuals making better choices, we see a limited opportunity for bringing about meaningful change. In fact, lots of the things that need to happen in order for us to consume and live in harmony with planetary limitations and natural systems is to change the structures of everyday life so that we can actually have a more positive and less negative impact upon the natural environment. The reason that we focus on some of these themes within this module is because a lot of the time when people think about the impact of people in the natural environment, they tend to think about physically, especially on courses like environmental science and geography courses. We're talking about actually going out into the countryside and the impact that people have there. So this top picture here is a picture of footpath erosion, which is one of the ways, a very direct way, that people think about human beings damaging the natural environment. But actually, most of the negative impacts that we have are indirect, and they're through the ways that we consume and through the industrial processes that underpin the norms of our everyday lives. So, in order to start thinking about meaningful scales of change, we're going to talk about sustainable practices and models for living. And I've got three examples of those to share with you today. The first is the sharing economy, the second is the 20-minute neighbourhood, and the third is circular cities. So the sharing economy first is something that probably most of you are already quite familiar with, even if you don't think of it in the terms of the sharing economy. So there are some major players within the sharing economy, things like Uber and Airbnb. These started off as platforms that enabled individual property owners and car owners to share the resource. So it was a lift sharing scheme for Uber rather than a taxi service. An Airbnb was people, and it still is, people being able to rent out rooms in their own houses or temporary short term lets of their property while they're somewhere else as a way of generating income. But also, what's happened is it's kind of diversified the market for things like holiday homes and temporary travel away from more kind of established taxi firms and established holiday homeowners into a kind of more diverse network of people sharing spaces and resources. In addition to some of those big companies, you can also think about things like carpools and car clubs as alternatives to owning your own car, cycle hire, cycle loan schemes, and something called the Library of Things, which I will introduce to you later. So the sustainability of sharing is good in principle. So it could include things like, as I mentioned previously, the Library of Things, which is a kind of repository of items that people may need to use occasionally, but maybe don't need to own all of the time. So quite often things like power tools or a musical instrument that you might need to borrow is one of the examples in the Library of Things. But lots of things that people maybe don't actually need to own themselves, but could use for a short period of time when they need it. What's important though is whilst there is a kind of good underpinning principle of sustainability in the sharing economy, in that the idea is that there are fewer items being produced and that has positive impacts upon natural resources, we have to be really careful that we don't just accept that the sharing economy is automatically going to lead to a reduction in consumption overall, a reduction in product manufacture overall. Certainly things like Uber, whilst it does in theory reduce the number of cars on the road, it doesn't do anything to interrupt that expectation that you can get wherever you want to get by car. So it keeps cars on the road, and it keeps us away from maybe more long-term holistic approaches to sustainable travel, like active travel, cycling, walking, and public transport networks. It's important to remember that in order to get people to adopt a new practice, so to move away from something unsustainable towards something that's more beneficial to the environment, it has to be convenient. Now, it doesn't have to be as convenient as owning your own product, but there do have to be clear advantages over ownership in order for people to be prepared to widely adopt the practice. So, whilst it still makes more sense for you to own your own product or your own car, and it's more expensive to access any alternatives, it's going to be difficult to get people to make these transitions. It's important to think about what these practices actually suggest in terms of change. So if we were to move away from owning all of the products that we think we may need to use at some point in our lives towards being used to actually hiring them or borrowing them when we need them, then there are certain changes in the way that we organise our lives that are suggested by that. One of them is planning ahead for when you might need to access a resource. So it can be completely disorganised. If you own your own drill, it could sit there unused, as I think maybe my drill does, for around, 50 weeks of the year probably, almost, maybe not that many, but most of the time it just sits in a cupboard and doesn't get used. But I could, in theory, anytime I want, go and get it and do some work in the house. If you need to borrow something, then you need to be organised enough to anticipate your needs in advance and make sure that you can access that item. It does also move away from this psychological need to own, and that is quite a powerful one. We have been encouraged for a long time to think about items of ownership as being, status symbols almost, and that you want to have your own drill. You might want to have your own garden equipment, or all the items that you might occasionally need. So we've been encouraged to have our own, and now we've got to move away from that. And that's a psychological shift. One of the things it could mean is prioritizing quality and space over cost and convenience. So, whilst it needs to be reasonably convenient to move away from ownership, maybe what we would be looking at is access to higher quality items than we would probably choose to buy ourselves, and also not to have to find space to store them. And increasingly, as we look at living in higher densities in cities, the second factor, space, is really quite an intriguing one to explore, because that's a real benefit. So not having to make space in your homes for all of these items is actually looking like an increasingly favourable thing to help people make that transition. The second example I want to look at is the 20-minute neighbourhood. The 20-minute neighbourhood is a design principle for designing new settlements or for adapting existing human settlements. And the idea is that you reduce the need to travel by vehicle and you reduce the need to own a car. So most things should be accessible by active travel within a 20-minute walk radius of the home. And that really suggests living locally, shopping locally, going to school locally, and accessing most key services. It doesn't mean everything has to be in the local area or walkable. It's also about connectivity on a public transport network. So increasingly try to get rid of longer journeys in 20 minutes, both by walking or using public transport. One of the things that this means is obviously shifting towards a local economy. That might mean maybe favouring more independent businesses or using things that can be provided in your local area. In order to support this kind of design principle, we need to look at residential density. And that means having a higher density of residential accommodation within a particular area, because you need a lot of people to be within this 20-minute neighbourhood in order to sustain all of that infrastructure, both the transport infrastructure and all the different services that you might need. The 20-minute neighbourhood has lots of benefits and lots of advantages over the design of cities that still relies upon people having access to a car to be able to get to most places. There is a social inclusivity and justice focus. So it is about making sure that you don't end up with really exclusive neighbourhoods and then really socioeconomically deprived ghettos, and all of the differences in terms of access to goods and services that suggests. So this is really quite an ideological approach as well as a design approach. One of the things that it does really challenge is this dominant logic of global supply chains. So we're currently expect to be able to have access to all sorts of services and goods that are provided and driven into our cities, driven into the shops, delivered to our homes. And if we're going to look at a 20-minute neighbourhood, it's not only just about walking everywhere that we want to get to, it's about reducing some of those supply chains. It does create an opportunity for healthier and more natural environments, even though we're looking at living at higher densities in cities, because it relies upon having a really good quality green infrastructure to encourage those kinds of active travel that make the 20-minute neighbourhood work. As I say, one of the things that this does suggest in terms of types of change is accepting maybe a reduction in range of choice. So if you're looking at a local food supply, for example, then you're not going to have access to all of those kinds of products that you're used to having if we rely upon global supply chains. So 20-minute neighbourhood includes things like local food production. What does that mean in terms of consumer choice, and what would we be willing to do in order to support that kind of approach? Access to local schools means being prepared to use your local school. As we know, at the moment, people can choose to travel quite wide distances across the city or even to different cities to go to different schools. So if we're going to really make this kind of design principle stick, then we need to shift people's willingness to actually be able to go to their local school again. Foregoing the car is a really important. This doesn't work. The 20-minute neighbourhood doesn't function unless people are prepared to not drive. And that might mean designing out the car, or it might mean hoping that people voluntarily don't use their car. More likely to be the former if it's really going to work. And obviously, that is again a big ideological shift. It's a big shift in what people are expected to, from their lives in terms of how they're going to access goods and services. The final example I'm going to discuss with you is one of circular cities. So the circular cities is a really interesting idea. Again, it's about redeveloping urban practices so that we can close some of these resource loops. At the moment, the argument goes alongside with circular cities is that cities are heterotrophic entities. In other words, they're like a living organism. They take in resources. They need resources to survive. So you take in lots of food and lots of energy, lots of water systems, and everything else, and you process those in the city. The residents of the city process them and produce an awful lot of waste. So the idea here is to close those loops, to look at, stop thinking about waste production and start looking at how to recover, reuse and recycle most things that the city needs, including energy, heat, organic resources and hard materials, things like building materials. I'm going to look at the example of Amsterdam, because Amsterdam has a really well developed strategy that they are already implementing in terms of becoming a circular city. So what this means in practice then is setting up systems that recover all scales of materials, from building materials to organic flows, water, waste, food, etc. And it creates an economic model that sees waste as a commodity. So things that normally would be seen as needing to be disposed of are actually the recovery systems are put in place to extract things like nutrients, precious metals, and all elements of waste products can actually be harvested, separated, processed, and reused again. And you create an economic model where that's built in. So there is no way that you can, the costs of throwing things away become enormous for industry and individuals. And therefore you have to sort of engage in these recovery systems in order to make the financial stuff stack up. So waste becomes a commodity that is bought and put back into the process rather than thrown away. In practical terms, Adopting a circular city model means a lot of things for the industrial sector, for the manufacturing sector, which you can read more about in some of the resources I've included at the end of this talk. But at a domestic scale, what we're looking at here is a really dramatic shift and a huge increase in the practice of recycling. And that is because it no longer becomes an option to manage your waste sustainably. It now becomes part of a really complex system where there are no alternatives. Now, that does suggest quite a lot of work. These are all things that maybe we could get used to doing and to have really good infrastructure in place to support that. But it also will require, again, like some of the other examples, reduced consumer choice and us accepting that. It simply isn't going to be possible, probably, to maintain our current range of choice and the ways in which we expect to be able to consume and to do that more sustainably. So, one of the big conceptual shifts, ideological shifts in moving towards more sustainable practices is accepting a reduction in consumer choice and to be able to choose from a smaller pool. It also, at a domestic scale, for things like the circular city, means accepting new modes of production and consumption with a much greater visibility of waste streams. So if you know that your solid waste from your domestic toilet system is now being recycled into create things like energy. So it could be fed into energy systems, but it could also be used to in farming and food production as fertilizer. And how do people feel about that? How do people feel about using different types of water for things like flushing the toilets or for cleaning their homes rather than using drinking quality water? And also, again, being prepared to sort of buy into, if you'll excuse the pun, local economies that are using recycled resources and are calling upon local skills. So we're moving away from some of those ideas of globalization that have really dominated our identity in the way that we expect to be able to consume for a very long time. So those are exciting developments potentially, certainly from an environmental perspective. They have huge potential to make a real difference to the way that we live and the way that we are able to live going forward. But they all require quite dramatic changes in kind of cultural expectations around choice and consumption and the different sorts of ways in which we will live our everyday lives in these new kinds of configurations of cities. If you're interested in looking into some of these things in more detail, there are loads of resources on sharing economy and the 20-minute neighbourhood and circular cities, but here are 3 really accessible ones that you can have a look at. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'll see you in class.